Hi, I'm David Judson. Joining me here today at Stratfor to talk about Turkey are Reva, Bhalla, and Scott Stewart by Skype. What we want to talk about is that Turkey just 4 years ago was the Turkish model. It was being widely held up and regarded as an example of reform and democratic reform for the Muslim world, and particularly in the Middle East. Since then, things have changed dramatically. There's been a slow brewing, building perfect storm around Turkey in a geopolitical sense. Obviously a hung election last June, conflict on the Syrian border, tensions with Russia, a renewed insurgency with Turkey's Kurdish population, and then last weekend, the most damaging bombing terrorist incident in Turkish modern history. So where do we go from here is a big question. But I wanted to start with Scott. Can you give us a take on the tradecraft, kind of a context for this bombing that happened on Saturday?
Well, clearly what we had was a suicide bombing using two operatives directed against a very soft target. We've seen several organizations in the region use suicide bombings in the past. Everybody from the PKK to the DHKPC to the SSMP from Syria, and obviously the jihadis from Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So it's very difficult just based on the fact that we had a suicide bombing against a soft target to pin it on anyone. But I believe that when we look at kind of the totality of the circumstances, it probably was the Islamic State because they kind of have the most to gain. Some people have been making a big deal about the fact that the Islamic State has yet to claim credit for the bombing. They usually tend to do so rather quickly. But they're pretty savvy when it comes to their propaganda, and they're smart enough to understand that they benefit from the chaos that's created by the ambiguity that's currently surrounding the situation. So the fact that they haven't claimed it yet doesn't mean that they haven't done it.
A lot of ambiguity, Reva. Can you help us understand and clarify bits and pieces, specifically the election that's now 2.5 weeks out, whether we're basically going to see a repeat of what happened in June, and then moving beyond that, the broader question of whether Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, as Scott was saying, Islamic State benefits from the ambiguity, and it also benefits from the backlash against the ruling party from this attack. And very quickly we saw that reaction, which was not, all Turks need to band together against the greater threat of Islamic State. It immediately went to the AKP is responsible for putting us in this situation in the first place, for causing these security vulnerabilities, for not providing enough security, especially when it comes to these pro-Kurdish rallies. And so the AKP is being perceived by large segments of the opposition as actually complicit in the attack. And that perception is a very important one going into this election. And as you and I have talked about extensively, this election is going to be another, hung parliament, most likely. I mean, when we compare the situation from June to now November coming up, what position is the ruling party in? The economy still in very poor shape. When we look at Erdogan as a very alienating figure in this race, and that, anti-Erdogan sentiment is only growing, I would argue. And so when we look at that past election where many anti-Erdogan supporters put their votes behind the pro-Kurdish HDP, this time around, with the Kurdish issue now in play and, with the military resuming its attacks against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, not as many Turks may put their votes behind the pro-Kurdish HDP, but they're certainly not going to go back to Erdogan and his AKP, right? So that's where the main opposition parties would pick up those votes. So getting, to the main point here, any factor that we look at, whether it's security, whether it's political, whether it's economic, it does not look like Erdogan is going to get his wish of regaining his parliamentary majority. You can look at any poll of any bias, and they all sort of come out to the result of, at least the AKP getting around maybe 40% or so of the vote. And that's not enough. And we know this is not necessarily a party and leadership that is comfortable with ceding power, sharing power. So I think those coalition talks are going to be rough, even tougher than before, now that the opposition will, in a sense, feel even more emboldened if the AKP is seen as losing a second round and not regaining its majority.
So, but I mean, where does this leave us with a divided polity, a angry country with tensions rising on many fronts? I mean, it's a bit ironic. Turkey's going into 3 weeks after the election, playing host to the G20 summit when it may not soon qualify to be part of the G20 with the way the economy is going. So can you give us some sense of where our forecast is going on the role Turkey is going to be playing? Iran, Russia, European Union, a kind of semi-reluctant partner with the United States, even against the Islamic State in the Greater Levant. So.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at Turkey overall, where is this going? Turkey's in for some very, very dark days. And politically, when we look at the situation, if we remain in political limbo, which I think we will, the economy is going to suffer for that. You're going to see more political violence as a result, not just from Kurdish militants, but from far left forces that have made a resurgence more recently. And then, of course, we have the jihadist element from Islamic State. So the security environment overall will be poor. If we are in this political limbo again, and a coalition cannot be formed, and I think that negotiation will be very difficult, I think we have to look at more extreme scenarios. And one scenario that I've been looking at very seriously for a while now is, if we combine, the two forces that are preoccupying the ruling party, and that is A, this political situation at home, and B, its foreign policy situation in Syria, where Russia is playing a very obtrusive role and complicating Turkey's plans to establish this so-called safe zone in northern Syria. If the ruling party felt that it's not getting anywhere on the domestic political front, and at the same time it's facing this escalating jihadist threat in Syria and has, in some sense, the legitimacy to do more in Syria militarily, I think we have to look at a scenario where Turkey uses that military pretext in northern Syria to essentially put off another election if we end in a stalemate somehow. And that's where, of course, things get enormously complicated for Turkey, not just with the Europeans, where Turkey is driving a hard bargain on this migrant issue, trying to extract concessions, but with the United States, where on the one hand, Turkey is going to be coordinating with the United States in the weeks and the months ahead on a big offensive west of the Euphrates River, against Islamic State. And the intent of that operation is to flush out Islamic State from that border area. From Turkey's point of view, that's very important to, as the first steps toward establishing this safe zone. From the U.S. point of view, the U.S., of course, wants to flesh out Islamic State, but they really do not want to fulfill Turkey's objectives of these more ambitious plans of having a Turkish presence in northern Syria, having to secure that, having to man that. It gets much more complicated from here.
One way or the other, it is going to be a region to keep a keen eye on. No easy or necessarily good outcomes, and be a lot to watch going forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us here at Stratfor. Thank you, Reva. Thank you, Scott.